This evening, I have the opportunity to host Wissam al-Saliby. He has an incredible background and a very interesting connection to the legal world here. I'd love if you could just briefly share with our listeners a little bit of your background in the sense of how do you correlate law and religion in your background?
I am Lebanese and lived most of my life in Lebanon before I had a calling to move abroad outside of Lebanon. And the first 7 years of my life were during the last 7 years of the Lebanese Civil War. So when I talk about law, as a personal journey, living during conflict, but also in a post-conflict society, I grew up feeling, the need to be a voice for justice, a voice for peacemaking, a voice for human rights in societies like Lebanese, like in Lebanon. Yeah, I grew up as a Christian early on. My background is Orthodox Christian, but came to faith as an evangelical early on in my life as a teenager. When I decided to do law, it wasn't necessarily a faith decision. I just felt like as a Lebanese, in Lebanon with so much injustice around us, in our country around us, I felt like I wanted to be a voice for justice, for peacemaking. And then in Lebanon, my 4 years, and then did a master's degree in international law. And that master's degree's focus was human security, meaning humanitarian law, peacekeeping, the Security Council, the United Nations, refugee law, protection of minorities, international criminal law. And it was a unique field, which is also kind of connects to the fact that I come from a region where there's a lot of armed conflict, so the laws of armed conflict. So that's what I studied in France. And again, there was a disconnect I would say, between faith and the legal career until I had a strong calling to work with the churches to advocate for religious freedom, human rights, against human trafficking at the United Nations in Geneva. And that's where my two worlds came together: my faith, the calling to ministry, and the work for human rights and what I studied. And that's where God started to use the skills, the knowledge that I had.
That was incredible. Thank you so much for sharing that. And that explains a lot about what drew you to work at this intersection of faith and law, but also how faith has influenced your approach to your career. Can you tell us a little more about, this specific point of your role and how that basically had this very important intersection of faith, international humanitarian law, human rights works?
On the contrary, Claude, these are roles that are always open. As Christians, we need to step into areas to defend life, human right, life in armed conflict. We need more Christians in these areas because this is our calling. When we talk about the utmost value that God told us, the utmost value is life, and human rights protects life, prohibits the taking away of life unjustly. The laws of our conflict protect life because they protect civilians, they protect non-combatants, they protect combatants who have been injured and they are outside of combat. In many contexts, the pro-life movement is equated with anti-abortion, and that is not an accurate depiction of the scope of work that we are called to, especially when there's so much armed conflict all over the world, there's so much violence, there's so much violation of human rights. We need more Christians, more churches, more associations, evangelical, Baptist, Pentecostal, to step into the area of defending life through defending human rights and the laws of armed conflict. Now, my personal journey, unfortunately, there's a lot of armed conflicts. There's no shortage in the Middle East for my line of work. Back then, when I was in Lebanon, I was working at dissemination and promotion of protection in armed conflict. And I was working with local Lebanese nonprofits, and I was working with a Swiss organization as a senior trainer on the laws of armed conflict across the Middle East. It's amazing work because it was much needed and it was much valuable and remains very important until this day, because every day there are violations of these important laws. The laws of armed conflict predate human rights law. The protection of civilians in armed conflict, the protections also of the wounded combatants who need support predate human rights law. The foundation for it was in the late 1800s when the head of the Evangelical Association in Geneva, Switzerland, Henri Dunant, he was the head of the Evangelical Alliance then. They convened in a church where I happened to fellowship back when I was in Geneva. They convened in a church and decided to send the first humanitarian mission to tend to the war wounded in a conflict that was happening at the time. where soldiers were fighting and no one was taking care of those who were injured and were left to die. So the genesis of the movement, that what we call today the International Committee of the Red Cross, was in the church. That's amazing. It was a Christian evangelical ethic that birthed the modern day Red Cross Committee and the foundations for the laws that apply to armed conflict. And that is so important, that is lost today. And we need more of that. And so that was what I was working on in the Middle East until I moved to work at the Arab Baptist Theological Seminary in the management and the operations of the seminary. That was my first step into ministry. And after that, we had a calling, me and my family, basically to move to Geneva. And in Geneva, the work became primarily issues of freedom of religion or belief, because working with the churches, with the World Evangelical Alliance, with the churches globally, that was a primary issue. And then secondary issues included ethical issues, human trafficking issues, and other life and key issues that were very important to the global church, the evangelical church all over the world. And that was the work I did in Geneva. And 2 years ago, we had a calling again. We prayed about it, and we were called to come to the United States with my family to lead 21 Wilberforce. Today, I am the president of 21 Wilberforce. 21 Wilberforce advocates for human rights and for religious freedom for everyone. And we work with the churches all over the world to support them, equip the churches to be advocates within their context to freedom of religion or belief for everyone, and for human rights for everyone, and also for peacemaking in times of conflict.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you explaining this very interesting career path for us. And I'd love to dive a little deeper when you mention about, religious freedom. I must say, most of my listeners here are based both in Canada and Brazil. And I think that these are countries that, even though they do have issues regarding religious freedom, sometimes we can be a little bit oblivious to what's going on around the world. So how do you see freedom of religion evolving globally, and especially when you look at this point that you specifically mentioned on conflict zones?
Most of the world's population live in countries where people do not enjoy the full extent of the right to freedom of religion or belief. I never knew that. As a Lebanese, growing up in Lebanon, we had religious freedom. We had wars, we had problems, but because we were a country of minorities, there was an agreement that religious freedom is for everyone, and that was very unique. Now I'm in the U.S. We also enjoy this religious freedom here, but that's not the case for most of the world's population, and most of the Christians in the world live under circumstances where they face either discrimination or harassment or persecution. And so that is the reality of the world. Now, it varies from country to country. Some places it's Islamic terrorism. Other places it's like in India, it's the majority Hindu groups that are threatening both Muslims and Christians. In other areas, it's secular atheist governments that are oppressive and that look at the churches as a threat. And then in other governments also, the rise of religious nationalism. Whatever religion it is, the rise of religious nationalism oftentimes comes at the expense of the rights of other religious minorities and communities. So, and then in other countries, the tribe, the clan, perceive the religious conversion as a threat, as leaving the clan. So whichever the tribe or clan is, whether it's religious based or other forms, ethnic. So this is all over the world, and it takes many shapes and forms, Claudio. But in my work, what is important for me is first to know that the church in many places in the world is growing, is flourishing. There's a lot of people who are coming to know Jesus, and that is the starting point. That is why there's a lot of persecution, because things are moving. And second, churches that face persecution, face challenges, harassment, discrimination, a large scope of threats. Many of them are pushing back or are trying to see how they could push back against this persecution. When I was in Geneva, I used to listen to them. I used to take their reporting, bring their voice into the United Nations human rights system. Today, I try to train, equip, partner with them in their own country, wherever they are, to come alongside them, support them in how they would like to expand this space for religious freedom and to protect the fruit of the evangelism and the gospel witness.
Fantastic. I appreciate you sharing that. What lessons from your work do you think that could help lawyers to engage in advocacy, to engage in their passionate work? Well,
there's a great need. I mentioned this, I have to say it again, for Christian lawyers, advocates, advocating for human rights, protection of the most vulnerable, whether it's in secular organizations or within faith-based organizations. We need more Christian lawyers. We need the ethics that comes with our Christian faith to be understood fully, to understand how human rights and humanitarian law, and broadly speaking, the Global Charter for Human Rights, all the various documents and United Nations documents, how they are relevant to protection of life, dignity of everyone, and we need to step into this. And it's needed within every country and every context. So I wish lawyers more delved into the issues. And maybe a lawyer is trying to identify where God is calling them in this, and they could take a course, a brief course online, a course in person. In many organizations, there is a lot of courses on human rights. After my master's degree, I had the unique opportunity to take a course on refugee protection in the Forced Migration Center in Oxford, for example. It was very important. There are courses on humanitarian law. There are courses on human rights, like 2, 3, 4-week courses, whether online or in person. And this can help lawyers identify if they would like to move from a corporate sector to the protection. Now, it doesn't mean that being lawyers and being judges is also a calling that is important in life. Various areas, the scope of intervention possible as Christian lawyers, advocates is large, and I hope and I wish more lawyers can step into these fields and fill in these gaps. Opportunities to learn more, to grow more in some areas, to understand more some areas where maybe it's a future calling.
Amazing. That's fantastic. So I'm curious about your thoughts, on how do you balance, personal faith, professional ethics? How do you show up to work as your whole self?
Well, I currently work in a setting that is a Christian setting, Christian, organization where we pray. Prayer is essential. It's part and parcel of the work we're doing. We're doing the work we're praying for God to give fruit to the labor. So we pray for God for that we shepherd the resources that He provides in the best way. So in that sense, I'm blessed to be in this area. When you're in ministry, it's easier. When I was in secular human rights work, at some point I let my employers know that I'm a very committed Christian, and sometimes it came as a surprise because they thought I was politically engaged in some areas, not as a Christian, because there's misunderstanding of the Christian faith in secular areas, which is very unfortunate. But there's a bias, a misunderstanding in some circles against the Christian faith, in some, not all. But so I at some point I'm very clear on who I am, what drives me in the secular area, to say that I'm doing this as a Christian because of my faith, because of my witness. So that's how it was before. But then now I'm more blessed because I operate in a context of ministry, but prayer is natural.
Amazing. Well, thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate it. As we get closer to the end of our episode here, if you would be able to discuss a project or case that has had a profound impact on your perspective of law and justice.
I've worked on a host of issues in Lebanon. I've worked, in 2006 on Israel's bombing of Lebanon and over 1,000 people killed back then. Sadly, this is an ongoing theme of tragedy in the news, the ongoing bombing and violence between Hezbollah and Lebanon, but also Israeli attacks on civilians and on health workers, on aid workers. Today, 3, health workers were killed while going to help people who were injured. It's tragic to be thinking, like, was there a military objective or not? Why did these people die? You're investigating war crimes. And then after that, in Lebanon, I've worked on refugee protection, and I got to meet people who are undocumented. I got to meet people who are refugees, and then advocating for their rights. It's hard because you come in and people have so many needs, and you're coming in just asking questions, and you feel like you need to do more. And then after that, I worked, unfortunately, with the conflict in Syria. I was involved in dissemination and protection and demobilization of child soldiers. At one point, I was part of a visit to a camp of demobilized children in one of the areas of the conflict. And I still remember 14 and 15-year-olds were so upset with us because they were just demobilized, and they did not want to be mobilized, the children, because they wanted to carry the guns. And we didn't meet the 16 or 17-year-olds because they were even more upset with us, and they didn't want us. I was in Nigeria with my current work. And when I meet with church leaders with Nigeria, every single time someone would tell you I was abducted and held for ransom. And then there's always someone, the pastors, leaders, someone, I'm meeting with them, and there's like extreme cases of violence that they witnessed. And you're trying to say, to them, how can we help you? Recognizing that it's such a difficult issue in areas that I can never go to because it's too dangerous, but they're there. These are the people who are there. And you try to understand how you can support, come alongside, defend, and advocate. And yeah, so this is my current work. This is a big project that we're involved in, 21 Wilberforce today, coming alongside Nigerian Christians in their advocacy. And I mean, on one hand, you feel like the task is huge, is daunting. On the other hand, we pray that God brings fruit to our labor and the labor of advocacy of the local church through the seeds that He plants through us. You're always like between, oh God, how can we help and support? But then at the same time thinking, violence has always existed, conflict has always existed, persecution has always existed. The question is, where is God calling us to respond to this violence? That is the most important question. Our faithfulness with what we do is the most important answer to this in the face of tremendous challenges. And that is my prayer every day, that I would be faithful in where God calls us and in the resources that He provides and in our work with churches in Asia, in the Middle East, and in Africa today.
If there is any kind of advice that you'd give to younger lawyers who are trying to combine their faith and legal practice, either, by working specifically at a more, public facing role, at a role where they will actually work with law and religion, or just, they're having a regular legal career in corporate office or, working at the court, but who want to live their faith more meaningfully?
Yes, I mean, either intern or volunteer with an organization, secular or Christian, working on human rights work, working on refugee work, working on protection of the vulnerable, or take a course, a short standalone course on issues of human rights, or read a book on these matters to see if this is if God plants a seed for a calling in the future to move to this area. Some of the corporate lawyers, have opportunities in the United States to do pro bono work sometimes, depending on some firms, and that's really good. I journeyed and I prayed to see where God calls me, and I was surprised in some cases. Like, I never wanted to leave Lebanon, and then I went to Geneva, and then I never wanted to come to the US, and then here I am in the United States now. So God calls us to places, and it's surprising. And the lawyers need to listen, to hear, not to resist, and then to discover. And then they can email me, info@21wilberforce.org, and I can share more. If they'd like to volunteer with us, if they'd like to intern with us.
Fantastic. I really appreciate you making the time to be in the podcast today and to share a few of your thoughts. It's much, much appreciated.
Thank you so much, Claudia. I appreciate it, and I'm grateful for your work.
Thank you. Likewise. And thank you so much for tuning in and listening to today's episode.